Ever get into like a really heated argument in an online game? You know, one of those where things get maybe a little too personal, a little too real.
Ooh, tell me about it. I've definitely had my share of, let's call them learning experiences about online etiquette.
Well, today we're diving into a case where that virtual anger, that heat of the moment stuff, actually spilled over into the real world. And the consequences were absolutely devastating.
Yeah, this one's rough. Really makes you think twice about what it means when we say the internet isn't real life.
Exactly. And it all starts with this online game, Tibia. Expert speaker. For those of us who might not be familiar with the online gaming world, set the stage for us. What's Tibia all about?
So picture like a massive online world, right? Like a fantasy RPG, but it's all happening in real time with thousands of other players. That's Tibia in a nutshell. You build up your character, go on quests, join guilds, the works. But here's the thing. In Tibia, the stuff you win, the in-game currency, it actually has real-world value. Like you could trade it for actual money.
Whoa, okay, so there are real stakes here. This isn't just about bragging rights.
Right, exactly. So you can see how things might get a little, out of hand if people are taking it too seriously.
And that brings us to our main players, Daniel Petrie and Gabriel Kuhn. Daniel's 16 at the time, living in Brazil. Reports suggest he had kind of a tough go of things, maybe a little isolated, and found himself spending a lot of time in this online world, in Tibia.
And that's often where things get complicated when these online worlds become like a primary escape or source of connection, because it can be really tough to separate, what's happening in the game from what's real.
Especially when you throw in the fact that the other player, in this case Gabriel, was only 12 years old.
Yeah. And right off the bat, that age difference sets off alarm bells. I mean, a 16-year-old lending any amount of money, let alone virtual currency that's tied to real money, to a 12-year-old, it's a recipe for trouble.
And we're not even talking about chump change here. Gabriel asked Daniel for a loan of 20,000 Tibia coins.
Right.
That's a lot, right? Like even today, that kind of virtual currency could be worth serious cash.
Oh, absolutely. Today, you're looking at potentially upwards of 15,000 US dollars for that amount of Tibia coins, although pinning down the exact conversion rate back in 2007 is a little tricky. But the point is, this is not some small-time loan. This is a significant chunk of change, especially for a teenager.
Okay, so we've got real money, a significant age difference, and this online world where the lines between fantasy and reality are already starting to blur. What could go wrong, right?
Famous last words, right?
Sadly, yeah.
Yeah.
Because this is where things take a really dark turn. So Gabriel, he gets this loan, these 20,000 Tibia coins, and then, he refuses to pay Daniel back.
And to make matters worse, he blocks Daniel in the game. So not only is there this sense of betrayal, but Daniel's cut off from any kind of communication or resolution within the game world.
Which, for someone like Daniel, who maybe found solace and connection primarily in this virtual world, that's got to be devastating.
Absolutely. It's like having the rug pulled out from under you.
Yeah.
And tragically, in this case, it seems that virtual betrayal triggered a very real and very dangerous rage. Because on July 23rd, 2007, Daniel goes to Gabriel's house, claiming he wants to talk to try and work things out.
But as we know, that wasn't the case at all, was it? What happened next is just, it's difficult to even talk about.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand, the full extent of what happened here.
Right, and it's brutal. Daniel, he attacks Gabriel, and the level of violence, it's just horrific. This wasn't just a fight that went too far. There was a level of rage, of intent that's just deeply, deeply disturbing. And then to make matters worse, he tries to hide the body, which really highlights this disconnect from the reality of his actions.
And it gets worse. Some of the details that came out about the crime scene itself, the way Gabriel's body was mutilated, and those symbols carved into his skin, they were symbols from the game, right, from Tibia.
Yeah, and that's where it goes from awful to just chilling, really. It wasn't just about the money, was it? It's like those virtual symbols, they became all tangled up with his anger, his need for revenge, to the point where the game and reality were just inseparable in his mind.
It's just such a terrifying example, like this world that we think of as separate from real life, this virtual space, it becomes a breeding ground for such real, raw emotions. And in this case, it led to something absolutely horrific.
It's a tough one for sure. And it forces us to ask some really hard questions about how we deal with this, right? As online gaming gets more and more intense, more real in a way, how do we make sure that the stuff that happens in those worlds stays there? How do we prevent it from spilling over into violence in the real world?
Right. And that's what makes this case so important to unpack, because the aftermath, the ripple effect, it's huge. Obviously, you have the immediate tragedy, the unimaginable grief of Gabriel's family. His brother's the one who finds him, by the way, which, God, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, and the police investigation, it doesn't take long. The evidence is overwhelming, and Daniel's arrested. He actually confesses pretty quickly. But here's the thing that gets me, the thing I find most disturbing. Even when faced with the real-world consequences of what he did, Daniel shows absolutely zero remorse.
Yeah, you get that sense reading about the case, almost like he's still caught up in the game world and that mindset of virtual justice, right?
Exactly. He keeps blaming Gabriel, calling him a coward, a thief, even saying that Gabriel's burning in hell, like he's the one who sent him there. It's like that blurring of realities again, you know?
Yeah.
Even when he's facing real-world justice, he's still stuck in this virtual world of revenge and punishment.
It's eerie. And speaking of justice, how does the real world even begin to address something like this? I mean, Daniel, he's a minor at the time. He ends up getting sentenced to 3 years in a juvenile facility. 3 years for taking a life, and in such a brutal, calculated way. It's hard to wrap your head around.
Right, and understandably, that sentence, it sparked a lot of debate. Was it enough? Did the fact that this whole thing started in an online game in Tibia, did that somehow make the crime less serious in the eyes of the law? It's a question that a lot of people were asking and continue to ask, especially as online interactions become more and more central to our lives.
I mean, were there any similar cases at the time? Outside of gaming, just to give us some kind of comparison, to see how the sentence stacks up?
Well, there have always been cases, especially with younger offenders, where it's like the lines get blurry between fantasy and reality. And sometimes that leads to really tragic outcomes. But the difference here, and it's a big difference, is that this all played out in a virtual setting, right? In this online world where everything from relationships to money to even, it seems, justice, it all works a little differently. So the question becomes, how much should the courts consider that? The influence of these virtual spaces when they're deciding, accountability and punishment.
Right, because it's not like this is just some isolated incident, right? This case, it sent shockwaves through the gaming community, especially in Tibia.
Oh, absolutely. Players were outraged. Outraged at the crime itself, obviously, and then a lot of anger about the sentence, feeling like it wasn't enough. Some people even quit the game altogether, like they couldn't reconcile their enjoyment of this world, this virtual world, with the fact that it could inspire something so real, so horrific.
Which is understandable, right? I mean, Suddenly it's not just about in-game squabbles anymore. It's like realizing there's this potential for real darkness within these communities. And that's a tough thing to grapple with.
No kidding. And it speaks to this bigger issue, this fear that online aggression is going to spill over into real-world violence. Because it's not always as extreme as this case, obviously. But you see it all the time, the trash talk that escalates to cyberbullying, the harassment, the doxing, all of that has real-world consequences.
And it feels like for younger generations, the ones who've grown up immersed in these online spaces, it's even more blurry for them, right? That line between virtual and real. So what do we do? How do we even begin to address this?
Right, and that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it starts with open communication. Parents, educators, even the game developers themselves. We need to be talking to young people about online behavior, about digital citizenship. Like, how do you treat people online? How do you handle conflict? How do you know when things are going too far?
It's like we're all figuring this out in real time, but the stakes are incredibly high. And sadly, in Daniel's case, there's not much closure. I mean, no one really knows what happened to him after he was released.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. Some people think he's out there trying to put his life back together, staying out of the spotlight. But the fact that we don't know, it kind of leaves that chilling question hanging in the air, doesn't it? Like, could he still harbor those same dangerous impulses, even if he's not playing Tibia anymore?
It's a sobering thought. And I think that's what sticks with me most about this whole case, the tragedy for everyone involved, but it's also this really stark reminder that this stuff is real. The choices we make online, the things we say, the actions we take, they have weight, they have consequences, and it's on all of us to remember that. So how do we ensure online spaces remain safe? That's something for all of us to consider. Hit us up on social media and let us know your thoughts.